because what we're talking about is women's rights and women's right to a life free of violence, free of harassment, free of sexual assault, and a right to simply live a life of freedom. So I'm very pleased to be joined by Gaynell Curry this evening. Gaynell is, as I mentioned, a human rights expert. She has done lots of work with the UN, as well as several organizations at the national and international level, both locally here in the Bahamas and around the world. She advises governments and other entities on a broad range of human rights and related issues, including gender equality, elimination of violence against women and girls, and sustainable development. She's worked with the United Nations for more than 23 years in various capacities and duty stations. And most recently, she served as human rights advisor in the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, Switzerland, where she led work on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So Gaynell, I'll just ask you to wave to our folks on Zoom so they can see you and meet you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us. So we'll get right into it. Again, please feel free to put your comments in the chat or to raise your hand and unmute yourself. We will begin with a brief presentation from Gaynell and then move into moderated discussion with questions from myself and the audience. So Gaynell, take it away. Okay. Okay, we'll just give Gaynell a minute or so. Thank you all so much for joining us. Again, this is our last event in the campaign, but there's still lots of work to do. So we are moving into 365 days of activism after the campaign. And so we ask that you follow us on social media, Equality242 on Instagram and Twitter, and facebook.com/equality242 to stay in the know and get involved. All right.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you, first to Equality Bahamas for inviting me, and to everyone on the line willing to listen in. I appreciate the opportunity, and I will do my best to go quickly through my presentation and have a dialogue. I think that's actually a lot better if we can have a dialogue and exchange on these issues. So let me get right into it. Throughout human history, in any great endeavor requiring common effort of many nations and peoples and men and women everywhere, we have learned it is only through seriousness of purpose and persistence that we ultimately carry the day. We might liken it to riding a bicycle. You stay upright and move forward so long as you keep up the momentum. This is a quote from the former UN Secretary General with whom I work, Ban Ki-moon, and I used this quote in an article I wrote in 2016 on women, peace, and security, along with my colleague Melissa Labonte, a professor at Fordham University. And I recently had a chance to reread this article, because what it's really talking about is how do we get change on women's rights issues? And that article that I referred to was entitled, or is entitled, Are We There Yet? And I can ask the same question here. Are we there yet? Because I wrote another article about arriving at a culture of rights. And I keep speaking about this journey that we're on as a people toward the type of life that we want to see, the type of society that we want to see, the type of world that we want to see. And for me, this momentum must continue. So I think that this idea that if we slow them, we're in the process of riding a bike. And if we've ridden a bicycle in at all in your youth, and going uphill and downhill, and what that actually means, and when you can pick up momentum and it slows down and so forth. So these words resonate with me in terms of the movement on women's rights and the slow moving agenda on ending violence against women in the Bahamas, in the region, and globally. So least I give the impression that nothing has been done. I want to say quite clearly that lots have been done. But, and that's globally and locally, but is it enough? In my view, it has been slow, too slow. And as I sort of wrote back then, occasional dips in the road have propelled the agenda forward. So when you go downhill, you move fast, and you're resulting in these efforts, these global movements and meetings, and you start speaking about SDGs and women's rights in the context of SDGs and so forth. And these are things that get us all excited and happy, right? We talk about meetings, we talk about celebratory events, such as the one we're in right now, the 16 Days of Activism. National Women's Week is a big one here in the Bahamas. Human Rights Day. These are great things. These are great activities, great events. The rapid gain in momentum resulting from these celebratory events, and also from tragedies, such as, sadly, baby Bella and the woman that was recently struck by a car. And it was surprising to me, and beaten up in the street while she was holding a baby and struck by a car. And it was surprising to me that it got such a whirlwind of excitement in the news that we're speaking about these issues. These are not new issues. Yeah, but we have this momentum. And as soon as it dies off and fades out in the news, we forget about the issue. And the same people that have been working on it continue to cry out like voices in the wilderness, where nothing or not enough is happening. So this sort of difficult coming out of the high points and coming out of these celebrations and coming out of these tragic, these discussions that result from tragic events, highlights the insufficiently resourced institutions, programs, mechanisms, services, lacking of services that we have, lacking of training, awareness, capacity building on women's rights and GBV. The lacking of a momentum that we need, that can carry us beyond, or that can survive successive administrative changes. That's the momentum that we want, that will go beyond. But the slow uphill climb becomes much more difficult for us working in these issues, working in the trenches, when we hear the voices that constantly remind women of their place in society, that constantly tell us that to speak about the status quo of discrimination and violence against women is to speak against our culture. Culture. What does that mean here in the Bahamas? Is it truly our culture to discriminate, to perpetuate violence against women and children, to promote and encourage inequalities based on socioeconomic inequalities, I'm referring to, based on gender as well? I think not. This is not our culture. Our culture isn't only about Junkanoo and Kung Fritters. While I love both, I certainly can jam to some Junkanoo music, and I love Kung Fritters, but that's not all who we are. For me, culture comes down to really who we are as a people and what we want to portray. So culture for me is about human rights. I cannot separate the two. It's about respect for all human rights of all people in your country, in this country. And the Prime Minister of Barbados said, when she was talking about an issue, being interviewed about the issue of, are you giving more rights to LGBTI persons in the country? And her point was, it's not about giving rights, right? It's about ensuring that all human beings within your society can access all of their rights all the time. That's what we're trying to do, build that society. And that is what I think the culture of the Bahamas is and ought to be about. It must be about tolerance, nonviolence, inclusiveness, if we are to move forward as a nation, to grow, to develop sustainably well into the future. Before we started, I was speaking about my daughter and her swimming, and I think about her often when I think about the future. What kind of future do I want for her, right? And it's a future certainly of tolerance. So for me, what is a culture of human rights? Because that's what I'm talking about here. That's really where we ought to be focusing our attentions. Because I'm asking the question, if we're not developing for people, for the enjoyment of all people in this, then why are we developing? For whom are we developing? Which segment of society? Are we going to cherry pick and say, well, you, but not you? Some for you, this much, less for the next person. Oh, you identify this way, so it can't be for you. Or you're a woman, so you can only have a certain amount. Or you have a certain religion and you can certainly have another amount, or no, nothing. Or you happen to be atheist and therefore you cannot be included. These are the things that I'm talking about. What kind of future do we want? Why are we doing it otherwise? Socioeconomic, well, economic development has to be about the enjoyment of this development by the people. So that has to be at the center of what we speak about when we talk about culture, when we talk about a culture of rights. How do we ensure that all of us get forward, get to where we want to be? The 2030 agenda speaks about arriving 2030. This is where we want to be. We're all off course, by the way. All countries are off course. We're not there yet. We're far off. But we're aiming towards something. And so we cannot be aiming toward intolerance as a country. And so to speak about non-discrimination and violence against women is not against our culture. It's about saying, hey, people, remember who we are. We're people of tolerance. So a culture of rights, and I wrote this a little while ago, and I have to apologize because it seems I'm going to be competing with the garbage collectors this evening. They're right outside my window. I apologize. But I wrote this a while ago, and I said, a culture of human rights speaks to how we engage as a people. Respecting self, you have to respect yourself first if you want others to respect you. And respecting others. So it's about people. It's about property, right? Yes, it's about respecting other people's properties as well. How we solve our problems using non-violent responses, starting in our homes. Do you only see mommy and daddy resolving their problems or through a fist fight or big yelling or something like this? It has to be about non-violent responses to disagreements. How do we resolve it? I constantly say to my daughter, use your words, use your words. She's always annoyed with me saying that, but I'm like, explain it to me, convince me. I'm encouraging her to use her words. Yeah, it's about starting this idea of nonviolent responses in the home, in schools, in our communities. The culture speaks to how easily and speedily we access justice and services, regardless of the nature of our complaint or the violation we may come to the police station with. How easily can we access justice? How quickly can I get the police officer to hear me, even though I've come to the station 10 times before saying, all right, I'm being beaten now. How can I get that consistent response to say, okay, I'm coming to help? Yeah, how can we, that's what we're talking about when we speak about rights. That sustainable response, consistent response to people that are in need, regardless of their sex, their gender, their sexual preference or identity, regardless of how often they may seek to use these services. It speaks to how we ensure the socioeconomic development, that socioeconomic development is inclusive throughout society. So we're not leaving out just segments of society. That will honestly come back to haunt us. How do we ensure that? And I think this COVID-19 experience that the globe has gone through, and we here in the Bahamas have faced so severely, particularly in terms of education, and leaving groups of children behind, and what that might mean for them in the future in terms of fitting into what we envisage as culture moving forward. We have to think about these issues. How do we ensure that that socioeconomic development brings them into the loop and they're not left entirely behind because of these circumstances that globally we're facing and that specifically we're facing in the Bahamas? How do we strengthen the capacity of government institutions to respond to the contemporary ills, including rising crime, gang violence, socioeconomic challenges, poverty, that became very clear again during COVID. People didn't have running water in their homes. Women were under threat and continue to be under threat in their homes. Women and children, for that matter. This idea of culture, to me, is something that we need to get into if we're talking about human rights, if we're talking about addressing some of these issues around rights and the rights of women. Because I've heard it say, even with the referendum, oh, it's not our culture. When I speak about human rights, people say, oh, you're coming with that Eurocentric stuff. It's not Bahamian, it's not who we are. And I say, I beg to differ. I think that as Bahamians, we have always had human rights at the center of who we are, of what we do and what we fight for. But we're cherry picking onto certain rights. So when we talked about racial discrimination, we were all on board. We do not tolerate racism. We want our independence. We want all, persons, regardless of their color, to be able to vote. But, as women, you can't have all your rights yet. I ask when. So let's talk about rights. Because I'm speaking about a culture of rights, and maybe some of us may not really get what are rights. So I'm going to give you some of the data that I have from my previous life with the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. So the office says human rights are rights inherent to all human beings, whatever our nationality, place of residence, sex, national ethnic origin, color, religion, language, or any other status. In essence, they are rights that one has simply by virtue of being a human being. They should not be, they cannot be taken away, although many try to institute and have instituted measures to take them away. But they are inherent to who we are. Yeah. The exception is where rights are taken away due to certain due processes. You go to jail or something like this, and you don't have certain other rights. Your freedom and so forth is restricted. But otherwise, we're talking about the rights that everybody has. That's what we mean. These are inherent to who we are as human beings. So they're not a new concept, human rights. It's been around for a long time, and countries have allowed it to develop individually to define human rights, what it's meant. And some countries have interpreted individual rights a little bit more narrower or wider, and some have evolved. We can think of a country like Switzerland, for an example, that is quite evolved in terms of their socio-economic, in terms of their economic and financial status globally. But when you look at the rights of women, they didn't get the right to vote in Switzerland until 1971, which is quite late. When you look at a country like New Zealand, they got the right to vote. Women got the right to vote as early as 1893. So it's evolving in different countries in different ways. And we have to see where we are as a country and how we want these rights to evolve for us. And so the rights, the human rights that I'm speaking about have come together initially under the UN Charter following World War II. And there was this big, the war really fought against, that was following the war, there was a discussion around social and economic rights, economic, social and cultural rights, and civil and political rights. Should we be talking about freedom from want? So that's hunger and so forth, which are socioeconomic rights, or should we be talking about freedom from fear? which is about civil and political rights, which they experienced significantly after war. Both rights were clearly very real, and I contend that rights cannot be easily separated. That's why I say you cannot cherry pick on the rights that you want to apply and not apply, and the groups that you want to apply them to and not apply them to. It's very challenging when you do that. And we must look at the universal respect for observance of human rights and the intersections of rights. So human rights affect me differently than it would affect my white male colleague from the UN. And I always used to say this to him. He's like, oh, but you work hard. I'm like, yes, we can both work hard, but the impact is different for us. I'm a woman. I'm a Black woman. I'm from a developing country. I'm from a small island developing state. And you're from the UK, you're a white male, and you're from one of the most developed countries in the world. And so when we come to the table, even though I'm leading the project, oftentimes they refer immediately to him. And then he said, well, this is my chief. You can talk to her. But that kind of challenge that we have remains today. Even in our country, as we discuss issues around gender, the extent to which we will accept women, what comes from a woman or what comes from a man, small, whether we will accept, which woman is saying it. Is it a white woman? Is it a wealthy woman? Is it a poor woman? Is it unwed? Is it an unwed mother? So all these issues come together differently, and we have to be willing to see how they intersect and how we ought to be ensuring and looking at the specific situation of groups within society. And I often talk about, when we look at this leaving no one behind principle that's embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals, we talk about how do you know who's being left behind? How do you see who's around the table? How do you know how these rights apply to women as opposed to men? How they apply to people in the family islands? So do people in Maguana have the same opportunities as the children here in Grand Bahama? Following Hurricane Dorian, certainly the children in Abaco and Grand Bahama didn't. I think their situation has been intensified even further with COVID-19 in terms of accessing all services, particularly school, health, and so forth. So we have a great challenge. So it's about understanding how these rights work for us. So the Charter of the UN, and we became a member shortly after independence in 1973, we became a member of the UN. And when you become a member, you sign on to the Charter, and the Charter itself speaks about rights, human rights, and fundamental rights, the right to life, right to be not be discriminated against, the right to a life free from violence. These rights and the promotion of equality are fundamental in the Charter and all the other documents that follow. So the Universal Declaration, which came after the Charter, also enumerated all these rights. Civil political rights, which talks about the right to vote. I mentioned earlier some of them, the right to vote, the right to have access to justice, the right to privacy, are among some of the civil and political rights. Economic and social rights, I'm really speaking about those issues around education, health, services, social protection. And this is where I think we have real challenges. I think we've made a lot of headway on the civil and political rights, particularly with respect to women, although we have still some gaps in the law that relate to equality between men and women. But we have not embraced social, economic, and cultural rights, and to understand how that actually impacts us and how the intersections of those rights relate to different groups within society. We have to unpack these issues. So the Bahamas has signed on to a number of treaties and conventions, including the Covenants on Civil and Political Rights, the two major ones that and the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Covenant. Those are the two major ones, right, on which form the base for all the other thematic rights that come up. So children's rights, rights of the child, the Convention on Discrimination Against Women, this Convention on Ending Racial Discrimination, Convention on Migrant Workers, Convention on Persons with Disabilities. We have signed on to, as a country, a lot of these rights, a lot of these conventions. The question is, are we aware as a society Do we get to benefit from any of the rights enumerated here? How do we know what's there and how they impact us? How does the rights of women play out in all of these different conventions that we signed on to? The core of all of these conventions is non-discrimination and inequalities, addressing discrimination and addressing inequalities. That's the core of it. And though that is what you need to address the challenge that women face in this country, addressing inequalities and addressing issues of discrimination. Discrimination, and we would have read, many of us, the report of the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women when she came here. And she spoke specifically about violence against women being about discrimination against women being at the base of the violence that women experience in the country. It's a perception that we have of women as lesser than men. That's where we are. So we have a lot of work to do, still as a country. We have, I will say, signed on to, I think it's 9 treaties already, and countries in the world have signed on to most of these conventions. There are some that are more ratified than others. For example, the Convention on the Rights of the Child is the most ratified. Interestingly enough, and you would have had it on CEDAW earlier in this series, a discussion, I think, with Marian Bethel, that the CEDAW Convention, though highly ratified, is also, there are lots of reservations. And I will add to that, that this issue of violence against women continues to be, of discrimination against women, continues to be a challenge globally. It's the most, this is the right, the human right, that gets the most pushback of any of the conventions or any of the rights enshrined in the international conventions. So we have, this is a global thing, and it's around this issue of whether or not states can get into what's happening in the family, and whether, and many of them, you'd be surprised to know who's really supporting it or who's against the rights of women in the global arena. And so we have to know ourselves, what we as a country have signed on to, and how does it relate to what we want to do moving forward and developing in a sustainable way beyond 2030. So what are we going to do about the Convention on CEDAW that we ratified in 1981, the Convention Against Torture? I mean, when we talk about torture, are the police still beating up people? Is that something that we accept? No, right? The Convention on the Rights of the Child, we spoke about baby Bella, but she unfortunately died. It is so sad. But many, many, many children in this country are beaten up every day and face violence every day. When I was at the department, we did work with children in Grand Bahama looking at sexual harassment. The 7th graders, so age 11 and 12. It was surprising how many of these children spoke about issues of harassment. When we did it in New Providence, we did it with older children, say 16, 17, 18-year-olds. And more than 40% of them in the group, and we had over 100 students, referred to harassment as a reality, as in they have been harassed as early as 8 years old. And many of them referred to, or some of them, I wouldn't say many, but some of them referred to incidents of sexual assault and rape. And we know that reports out of surveys done by with university students indicate that that's a real concern. Many of them have indicated that they have faced sexual violence and rape. The conventions that we've signed on to speak about these issues. The question is, are we as a country, as a government, are we holding the government accountable for implementing these conventions? One of the things that is interesting is that when we sign on, we don't just sign on and it sits there pretty on the shelf. We have obligations. And one of our obligations is to report to the international community what we're doing, right? And civil society gets an opportunity to report what the government is not doing. And also to say if they think the government is doing a good job, of course, but to really say where the challenges are and to try to highlight those concerns so the experts, international experts, can get a fuller picture of what's happening in the country and how they can respond. We have had a number of very good recommendations coming out on women. We almost have the blueprint set for what we ought to be doing to address violence through the human rights processes, through the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. The committee has done recommendations and recent recommendations, I think as early as recent as 2018. That's not that far back, right? And the special rapporteur was also here just a couple of years ago on violence against women and enumerated a whole list of recommendations as to what we ought to be doing. The ones that are quite obvious to her, the sexual reproductive health and rights issues around abortion, around age of consent, around access to services on equal footing for young ladies, for young women, those around marital rape, and some of the challenges that continue to impede progress on these issues. They've spoken about the need for laws on these issues with respect to gender-based violence. They've spoken about the need to reform the Constitution with respect to equality or inequalities that exist currently based on gender. And I'm going to wrap up right now. But we have, as a country, very poor reporting record on what we're doing with human rights. And I think it's because we have not linked human rights to the development agenda. And where there is that disconnect, we cannot begin to see how this, because when we think about development, often our culture comes into it. But when we think about rights, we think about something else. We have to bring these issues together and show that there are synergies between human rights and development, and building that culture of rights that we want well into the future. So, but we have to first of all, educate ourselves about what exists and what doesn't exist, what we have signed on to. We've ratified CERD, CRC, CEDAW, civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, rights of persons with disabilities, and the Convention Against Torture, and several optional protocols with regard to children in armed conflict and the sale of children. The Special Rapporteur on Trafficking was here and spoke to issues and gave some very solid recommendations, again, about what we ought to be doing. Sadly, these recommendations sit on the shelf, right? There is trafficking, and not only for labor, for sexual violence, for sexual labor as well. So we have to know what we've signed on to, what these are about, and how we can engage. So embracing human rights in the way forward. I think as a human rights advocate, I see recommendations from these UN human rights entities. And I would say the Universal Periodic Review has also enumerated a number of recommendations. And we have also locally enumerated a number of recommendations. So I feel like we have all the recommendations. Why aren't we doing it? Why is there lack of commitment? And again, I contend that we have not connected it to what we are doing in terms of development process, what we are doing in terms of building the culture and the people that we want moving forward. Have we incorporated some of these human rights principles at the educational level, tertiary to primary, or primary to tertiary, I should say? I think not. Are just understanding basic, simple principles of what is gender, of what is tolerance, what are rights, how do we respect, protect, and promote rights? Those are what we ought to be thinking about. These recommendations, I contend, present an opportunity for the government to set priorities in terms of specific rights, and to make those linkages to development in their vision for the country moving forward. You can't look at them separately. They have to be included in what you're doing in terms of development. So it should be sort of really intimately related to what we're doing on a sustainable development goals, what we're doing in terms of that national development agenda, what we're doing in terms of what types of programs are we introducing at the University of Bahamas. Do they ensure that we incorporate human rights? And so it's really about how civil society and others can reflect on priorities, can reach out in terms of engaging. I think Equality Bahamas is doing an excellent job in terms of getting into the communities and understanding community engagement and responding to the people and bringing programs at the level of the people. right? And using current media and in an interesting way, introducing these concepts and ensuring that they are disseminated in society. It's also an opportunity, as I said, for I think for vulnerable groups, if we can hear and understand, to have an opportunity to hear this, for us to hear their stories, to know. And I encourage civil society all the time, write reports. It doesn't have to be a long and elaborate thing. We need to write, we need to document, we need to collect data. That's the way we can show what is actually happening in the country and what we need to do and how we can encourage, can't say forced, but encourage our leaders to go in a certain direction. When we can say, listen, this is happening to girls when they don't access, when they're not able to access services. Many of them end up with sexually transmitted diseases. Many of them, girls more than boys, end up with HIV and AIDS because they have not been able to negotiate protection for themselves. Right? So we have to be able to say that. We have to show that data and show how that plays out in everyday life. How does the situation of single mothers relate in this country? And what has been the impact of COVID on domestic violence, early pregnancies, rape, since, for the last year and a half to 2 years? So this is what we have to do. I think we have the recommendations already. We have the blueprint. We have everything we need to move forward. We need to move. We need to embrace it and see it as a part of our development process. And I know I'm reiterating this, but I want to get it in there. We have to see human rights as a part of our culture in order to move forward. And I'll leave it there and open up for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gaynell. You made some really good points there, but I think what I want to ask you about first is getting the government and institutions to act, because, similar to what you said at the beginning, some horrific incident takes place, and then there's all this attention and, dialogue about, well, what's really going on here? And then it's forgotten about and, everyone moves on until yet another incident happens. And again, that gets media attention and everyone is like, oh, well, what went wrong? Where was this person, that person? And similarly, right, with the government, we see all of these ratifications of international mechanisms, even recommendations coming out, but still no real concrete action. So what have you seen in your work over the last few decades at the UN when it comes to actually applying these mechanisms to get governments to act? Like what can be done, and how important do you think these mechanisms are for moving progress forward?
I think that, well, first of all, let me say that all states are struggling with human rights. They're facing their challenges. But I think those states that for me, and I worked in a lot of post-conflict settings, those states that are eager to embrace human rights and that are committed to human rights are those states that have been denied, or major segments of the population have been denied rights. So when you see a country like South Africa, when they came out of apartheid, they were warring. And they put together an awesome constitution. They put together strong and solid constitutional institutions with respect to human rights. They have a sound, human rights institution that's training persons from across the diaspora, across the continent, on human rights. Again, for me, it came out a lot clearer because they were coming from a deficit. Like, we've been denied our rights. We want to make sure that we can put some things in place so that this never, ever happens again. I see a big movement in places like Rwanda, particularly because there was such a tragedy with the genocide. And so you have people willing to make big, bold moves to ensure that this doesn't happen again. I was in East Timor at the time of independence. Fantastic time to be there. I was a human rights advisor in East Timor, and I have to say that was the most welcomed I have felt in terms of human rights. They wanted everything and they wanted it now, right? So they wanted to sign on to everything. They wanted to ratify everything. They wanted to put the institutions together. And I'm like, okay, let's do it step by step, right? But the enthusiasm was that they had been denied that their rights when they were a colony of Indonesia. And they were eager to sign on, to understand, and at all levels. I was amazed. I had the possibility, and I spoke with the president, the prime minister, the foreign minister, the president of the assembly. I mean, they wanted to know, what can we do? Which one should be prioritized? They were eager. They were hungry for it. I think for us, we've been, it's a little bit inertia, I guess. I don't know what it is, but I feel, and that's why you get that push right after a tragedy like Bella. You get that push and people are like, this can't happen, and so forth. But we are very content and relaxed as a people, right? Because we haven't really gone through those levels of tragedies, right? We haven't been through a war. But there are countries that embrace it still, who haven't gone through, say the Nordic countries. They embrace it. They embrace human rights, but they do have the memory of World War II. Europe has the memory of World War II and the devastation that took place there, and the killing of the Jews. They have that memory. So there is something. So we have to find out what will get us to move. I don't want it to be more Bellas. I really wouldn't want that. I don't want more women beaten up for us to say, listen, you know, a woman is beaten up or killed every day. We talk about femicide in this 16 days. Women are killed. I tell people all the time, when we were trying to collect data at the department, you know, we couldn't get consistent data because many times the information wasn't collected on that, right? So we know that, I don't know, you know, 25 women were killed, right? But we don't know, we don't have statistics on what is the nature of that killing. So was this intimate partner violence? And then if there is this pattern and trend that we need to discover, we can't if there's a lack of information. But I will just say that what I think needs to happen is more voices on this issue. I think we need to encourage young people. I would love to see it introduced in school from the primary level straight on up to universities, so people understand and they get it, right? There's a huge deficit. I feel like every time we change administrations, we start from zero, you know, and, oh, I don't like that policy, that was the F&M. Oh, I don't like that, that was the PLP. We have to come together as a people on these issues. That's why I said we have to see it as a part of our development process and see it as how we want to grow as a country if we're actually to address it. But as I said, it's a challenge in every country, particularly gender-related issues and women's rights. But those countries that push forward and push through tend to be those countries that have had major loss, devastation, war, and so forth.
Thank you. I mean, it's sort of a catch-22, right? Because we're not waiting for that. Like you said, we're not waiting for that tragedy to happen. We want to avoid it. But for whatever reason, the rates of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and femicide in this country has not led to that kind of uprising and embracing of human rights. So can you talk to us a little bit about the importance of language? Because the language in these conventions is very clear, very intentional. And we hope that, you know, calling these things as femicide will hopefully make a difference. But yeah, if you could just shed a little bit of light on that.
Yeah, I think, you know, the numbers are astounding. We have high incidence of rape in this country, and I've been saying that for years. When I was working on a project in New York several years ago, and my research assistant brought something to me on domestic violence, and the Bahamas was right up there in the top 10. And I called and I said, are you sure the Bahamas? I was ignorant of that fact. And I'd been working on those issues. I thought We were nowhere near the top. When I discovered that in 2007, the UN Office of Drugs and Crime listed the Bahamas as being among the top 10 in the world for rape and sexual assault, I almost fell off my chair. So I do believe that people don't know. And for whatever reason, it's being kept silent, right? More and more people are speaking about it. But I remember having some conversations when I was with the department, and I talked about these numbers and how we were doing globally and regionally. And at every meeting I spoke to, they were like, no way, the Bahamas, no way. So there is this denial that there is a problem. I think the first thing we need to do is accept that there is a problem. And then we can talk about finding the right language to bring people on board. And the people that ought to understand this is the government. And I'm not talking any particular party. I'm talking about the government and the institutions and the permanent structures of governance. They ought to understand this. There is no urgency even among them to address these issues. And I don't know what it is, but when we started that momentum in the department of doing a lot of sort of TV appearances, radio appearances, and really trying to get the message out there that this is a problem, we were off to a good start, which unfortunately didn't happen, we weren't able to finish. But I think that I'm hearing a lot more, I have to say, from the NGOs like Equality Bahamas, Zonter, Seawill, and a few. They are really working on this. And I think I can't remember the other one that Podesta Moore is working with. But they are actually doing the work, the heavy lifting that is not coming from government. You have a gender department that ought to be doing much more. And I say that even when I was there, more could have been done. Yeah. So I'm not criticizing anyone. I'm just saying that much more needs to happen. The training, the awareness, the understanding of these issues must come from them as well, must be embraced by the government and government institutions. If we are leading in the department on these issues, we cannot be silent on them either. And we must find the language in different ways, in the creative ways, to speak to the people. What is interesting is when we went to the Family Islands and we talked about gender, and we really had a discussion around what it means and so forth, they didn't understand the referendum or the questions or gender or any of it, what they were voting on. Yeah. So to me, you're very right. There is an issue of communication. There's an issue of language, and not sort of manipulating the language to what we want it to be. I have to add this point in here, and I will be as respectful as I can. And I'm meaning no disrespect to any group that's pushing this agenda, but since I've returned, I've only been home about 6 months. But what I hear a lot more of now is, well, what about the men? Men are being beaten up. What about the men? They're facing violence. Why are you only talking about women? And I'm saying, well, kind of the numbers of violence against women or domestic violence that women face are far larger than what men face. We're not saying that men don't face any, and we shouldn't look at that. But what we're saying is this large number of violations that we see against women and girls, women and children, but women and girls in particular, needs to be addressed specifically. And I always use that analogy, and people may get annoyed when I say it. If you go down the street and one house is on fire, you don't waste the water with all the houses that are not really burning yet. You try to address the one that's on fire and try to address that and try to see how you can come to terms with what's happening there. And then in doing that, you ensure that the fire does not spread. But that does not mean that other houses aren't under threat or maybe getting some sparks from the original fire. But we need to focus the attention on those issues with respect to women and violence against women in the country, because it is horrendous. Rape, I have to say, rape is a concern. And we cannot cherry pick on those issues. And this is my thing with violence. We cannot say, okay, we don't want you know, this type of violence, but that violence is accepted. You can rape your wife, but you can't rape your neighbor. You can rape your wife, but you shouldn't shoot somebody else if they try to rape your wife. I mean, it gets all sort of, you know, or you can hang someone. I heard a group the other day talking about we're for the death penalty. So we, you know, you're talking language of nonviolence, but you're bringing in violence by the state. You want, you know, so I mean, we have to come to terms with these issues. And I think we need to have honest discussions among ourselves as to what we're talking about. If we want nonviolence, then let's talk about nonviolence and talk about ending violence across the board. And let's start looking at those issues that are most urgent and those groups that are most vulnerable first. Hope I answered the question.
Yeah, no, some great points there as well. Particularly that one about the men, you know.
What about the men?
What about the men? Yeah. I think it, you know, it is related to people not wanting to accept that they might be part of the problem, right? So it's hard to accept the problem if you're being framed as part of the problem. But there's always something to be done, even if you're not the one perpetrating violence, right? There are probably people in your life that you can call out. There are probably ways for you to advocate and join this movement of trying to make human rights more accessible. So one thing that you touched on earlier was that, you know, human rights aren't something to be given. Can you talk about how in your work you've seen human rights be acknowledged in ways that we might be able to adopt here? Because I think, like, you know, like you said, we tend to cherry pick or want to say, hey, no, this is for me, right? And this idea that if it's for me, then it can't be for you, or if it's for you, then there's less for me. So you just talk about any sort of examples you've seen of how human rights has been properly acknowledged?
I think there are pockets globally where it's been acknowledged, right? And there remains challenges. There are certain tough areas that's always going to be a challenge. I think we've had the most success in the right to education for girls in terms of rights, right? A lot more girls are now being educated. Indeed, in the Caribbean, in the Bahamas, we're outperforming men, outperforming boys. And so you have the numbers at the university of graduates being much higher than for women than for men. And even in traditionally male-dominated faculties, such as medicine and engineering and so forth, they are now really led by women. And the same, I did a tour with the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. We went to Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, and Dominica. And this is a trend throughout the region. So we have done well on education for girls, that's for sure. And I think that's something that we ought to be proud of. But in being proud, we have to also remember that we need to keep our eye on the ball in terms of quality education and in terms of poverty, the intersection with poverty, and how certain groups within society are being left behind in terms of education, and now even more so with respect to COVID-19. So I think that is definitely something that I saw. I was in Afghanistan as well, and I thought they did recently. Things have declined regrettably, but when I was there, there was great effort being made to re-enter, to have girls re-enter school. And I mean, I know I worked with colleagues, Afghans, who were walking their daughters to school and ensuring that their daughters go to school and wanting their daughters to go to university and that kind of thing. And that was good progress. Regrettably, we lost that momentum. The Taliban has returned and so forth. And so it's difficult to know what's actually happening there. But recall working with women there and doing a lot of mentoring and sort of working on gender and women's rights issues, and just seeing how really bright those women were and how creative they were. And over the years, how they have been forced to be creative and to in their own way, find ways to enjoy their rights, or to demonstrate that right, and to the right to, particularly the right to education, and to find different ways. And I think it was good that they had some strong male allies as well. So that's another thing that comes to mind. And we know that war is one of those areas that one of those situations that sort of causes us to lose significant ground. Crime causes us to lose significant ground. Natural disasters causes us to lose significant ground. And that's something that we need to be mindful of in the Bahamas as well, in terms of how does climate change, natural disasters impact human rights, who are most vulnerable, and what kind of responses do we have, and are they human rights based or human centered, the responses I'm referring to. So when you have so we need to think about that, what kind of issues that we have as a country that may impede us and so forth. So yes, I've seen pockets where this has happened, but there's still so much more room, for advancement. We went to the US as well and looked at some Native American communities, and while there has been some progress in legal terms with respect to some rights with respect to land and access, there are still some challenges that they face. Also in that area, in terms of land, in terms of education, in terms of bodily autonomy, and lots of violence there. And so even where you have progress, pockets of progress, you can also find pockets where there are remaining challenges. For us, we really do need to focus on the vulnerable communities. We need to know who is vulnerable. We need to understand what their challenges are. And the main way we can do that is to study the process. And Alicia will know that I keep talking about this, what kind of research are we doing? I think UB is a great institution, and it does great work in terms of teaching. It is beginning to do a lot more work on training, but I mean, in terms of research, but I think a lot more can be done. In terms of what kind of research they do and how that research can be used to inform policy, and to direct policy. I look at a country like Barbados, and I've mentioned them before, and their right to education issues. I mean, I think they have been able to do a good job of depoliticizing education over the years. So it has been an issue that successive governments have maintained, a core policy on what it is they see in terms of the future of Barbados, in terms of its educational processes, and how how it can be used to build the country, to develop the country and move forward. So there are, as I said again, I will repeat that there are pockets in various countries, but there's room to grow everywhere in every country.
Thank you. I just want to pause there and see if anyone has any questions for Gaynell on anything that we've touched on so far.
Good night. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi.
Hey, this is Tennille. Was just wondering if everybody was aware of the gender-based violence National Task Force report that was released in 2015 or 2015.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, so just wanted to know if you had it and have gotten a chance to look through it.
Yes, I certainly have it. Others, if you haven't looked at it, I certainly would encourage you to do it. I think it was the task force did a fantastic job, very good job. What is sad is that the recommendations have not been fully implemented. Actually, we started 1 or 2 when I was there. I understand that since they've been working on 1 or 2, but they're far way off from implementing those. The task force put together a strategy that was sort of supported by UN Women in terms of putting it on a matrix and how to roll it out. It's been brought to Parliament and endorsed by Parliament. It's been highly recommended and by the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, by CEDAW, the committee. It's been mentioned also in the UPR. So everybody's talking about it, but we're not doing anything. The challenge with it, and Tanil, I'm happy you raised it, is, you know, if we really want to do it, we have to be committed to it. Again, it's about how do we bring these issues together. You know, this task force really was good at framing what the challenges are here. I think the next step for us is to look at that, because it's been a couple of years, 5-6 years, look at it, what needs to be updated, and then talk about implementing. There needs to be commitment, right? Commitment. You cannot say you're going to do this and then give the department $100,000, you know, for the whole department, for the whole year. And then you know, we advocated to get it increased. I was pushing for $2 million. I was not successful. We got 300,000. That's nothing. I mean, I shouldn't say that's nothing. It's not enough. Resources needs to be there, but I think more than resources, we need commitment. You know, we're trying to work with civil society to implement, and the Crisis Center is doing a very good job with one of the projects that we started to roll out, which is on psychosocial counseling for children traumatized by violence. And they were able to take that forward, and we were able to agree that and move that forward. And I understand, I spoke to one of the colleagues there recently, and she said it's still ongoing. I understand that it's oversubscribed and people always wanting to get it because there's a challenge, you know, but we try to engage other NGOs on other issues. How do we engage them in going into school? How do we do that in terms of working with men and boys? How do we go into the family islands and looking at family island communities and their response to gender-based violence? So there's a lot in there for us to digest. And I have to say that what they recommended closely mirrors what the UN has been saying. So we as a country agree. I just don't understand why we're not doing it, you know, why we're not committed to it. And maybe the urgency is not great enough. I don't know what we need to do, get the fire on under them to get them moving on this issue. But, you know, it's a great document. It's a must read for everybody working on this issue. And for as many people as possible. Another thing I was trying to encourage them to do at the department is to open up these spaces for NGOs, civil society, for just the wider public to go on, I don't know, on national radio, TV, and talk about the recommendations from CEDAW and what they actually mean, why and why not. Have a conversation. You know, tough conversations are great. And I mean, I've been beaten up in tough conversations on human rights too many times to count, but that's the work of a human rights advocate. People are not going to agree with you, and they're going to, instead of addressing the issue, they're going to attack you as an individual. So recognize that happens and move forward, because and don't personalize it as civil society, but we have to create those spaces. We have to have those conversations. This is a good forum. I think it's excellent. And the Wednesdays, Women Wednesdays, fantastic opportunity to discuss issues that are relevant to us. The more of these, someone said to me the other day, and Lauren, thanks for saying it, in terms of dividing up this issue on human rights. If you get some, you take away mine, and so forth. We often say in human rights that in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, that human rights is not like pie. So when you distribute it, it's all gone. No. The more you share human rights, the more others get human rights. And it's not something that's going to be depleted. You're not losing anything as men if you give us rights as women. You're not losing anything if you give people of African descent rights. You know, you're not losing things if you give minorities rights. You're actually ensuring that your society has a more human rights-based approach to how it's growing, that there's more inclusiveness, that there's more respect, that there's more tolerance. That's what you're trying to do. So everybody with rights, it's a good thing. I said to a colleague the other day when she said, oh, you're coming and you're going to be working on this issue, we're working on it. And I said, fantastic. the more people writing and talking and speaking about human rights, the better. I mean, I think if there were 50 organizations doing what you're doing, we might actually have some more progress on these issues. So you know, turf wars is not what it's about. We have to get beyond that, and we have to recognize that we're not the only voices on these issues. Others should have voices, and if we're saying the same thing, we're singing from the same hymn book, and we're saying human rights should be for all. There should be non-discrimination society. I don't see what the issue is. We're spreading human rights. We're not taking any rights from anyone.
Mm-hmm. So just in the chat, Alicia mentioned that updating and implementing that 2015 strategic plan is actually one of our 6 demands. So in addition to the events that we've planned for our 16 days, we also have 6 demands that we're asking of the government. And one of those is to update and actually implement the plan, because otherwise it sits on the shelf like CEDAW and like all of these other conventions that we've ratified but haven't moved on.
Yeah.
Nicole, you have a question?
More of a comment, but Ms. Curry kind of just alluded to it. What's been really helpful, I think, in Trinidad is that, well, Trinidad and Tobago, is coalition building. So what we did was, especially, even though the elimination of child marriage was a low-hanging fruit because it was already almost out, was a coalition came together, and what we did was try to target to whatever issue we were dealing with. And I think that's been pretty helpful. Also to the shadow reporting, both I think at the UPR level and I think CEDAW level, is also, I think, a really good mechanisms, because we know countries when they report like the nice enough stuff. When I think
Yes.
they really hear from the organizations that it's not that the government is not dealing with some of the survivors or anything like that, but for some strange reason, their reporting looks different than ours. But I think the shadow reports are definitely a way for other organizations and international agencies to really, really see what is happening. And I know countries don't like to be shamed into action, but it seems to be working. I wouldn't suggest it for everybody, but it seems to be something that's working. But I would prefer us to work with government, because at the end of the day, the whole country benefits. So.
No, thank you very much for that. I think those are very good points. Certainly the shadow reports are useful. And as I said, and when I worked with the treaty bodies, one of the things I constantly say to NGOs and others, you know, it doesn't have to be a long, elaborate report. Sometimes it's just a 2-pager where you're just highlighting some of the key concerns on specific issues. And I like the idea of targeting specific human rights, right? So if you're looking at child marriage, or you're looking at abortion rights, or you're looking at access to services for children, or whatever it is you're looking at, that's when you can, instead of when you zero in on those specific rights and you can get some traction on those, I think it's really very good. That's a good way to come together on particular issues. And as I said, the more voices on the issues, the better. I think Alicia has already done a shadow report, and I'm sure would be happy to have a consultation around that with other NGOs who are willing to do that. I'm also willing to. I did one some time ago with Donna Nichols, God rest her soul, as we say. She was so dynamic in human rights. You know, she had invited me when I worked with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to come and do a training on how to develop the shadow reports. And that was very well attended, and more reports could have come out, I thought, because it was a very good group who I think understood the issues and so forth. So we need to encourage that on all levels, for all the treaties, but particularly as we zero in on women's rights and gender equality issues and violence against women issues. Perfect. One of the things we look at, I mean, I did a lot of research for the treaty bodies as well. And as you say, Nicole, governments have a totally different thing. And when you talk to the NGOs or you read their reports, it's like, what? This is like 2 different countries. But it's important that you hear from all voices in society. And I think we have to get to a point where the government doesn't see this as we're beating up on government or we're criticizing them. Is us pointing out the gaps the areas where there is need for more work to be done. And it's not a personal thing. And I mean that for NGOs. I said I had to, depersonalize things. And I mean that for NGOs. I mean that for civil society generally. And I also mean that for government. It's not a personal attack on a government to say you're not good or whatever, but it's to say, listen, these are the gaps. And we have a tendency to want to look good. And that's the same with every state. Every state wants to look good internationally, and they don't want to be shown up. So we have to find a way to do that, and to do that respectfully, of course, but to do that consistently. And when you do that, they hear your voice. They listen. They absolutely do listen, because when they continue to go to these international conferences and they hear these international meetings, and they hear every single time, whether they want to, whether they submit a report or not, they're going to be reviewed by the UPR, and the UPR is going to say, hey, what's happening with this? Why are you not doing that? So they're gonna not want to be seen as not responding. They're gonna, because UPR will remind you, well, CDOR told you, the special rapporteur told you, all these people told you, and you're doing nothing. Why? So, we continue to push and to make recommendations, to write reports, and to encourage governments. I think it'd be a good idea, to hear the six recommendations. If not now, at some point, hopefully they'll be posted on your website for us to do work. And here comes my daughter.
Hi, Mommy.
Hi, Angel. It's going well. I'm not finished though. Give me about 5 more minutes, okay?
My towel.
Hey, kid.
Hello.
I had one more question.
Yeah.
If we were to choose a single most important action, what would that be? I think the sex offender registry, marital rape, those are very controversial issues. And I feel like it could sometimes convolute the whole process of engaging with government when we start off with things that just for whatever reason they don't see happening. So essentially, I guess, what is the lowest hanging fruit that we could join forces for and advocate for? I know the Crisis Center has been pushing for the sexual offenses court for probably about the last decade or so.
Mm-hmm.
In my mind, that might be
they're getting it.
one
They
of
look
them.
like they're getting it. They look like they're getting it.
Well, when they look like they're getting it is when we should jump on it and really push and push so they actually get it.
Yeah, I've heard some positive things recently in the news on that. So I think that sounds like something. I don't have the answers. I've been out of the country a very long time, and I'd love to hear from people who've been on the ground. I've been out of the country, just returning 6 months ago, to hear what are those issues. For me, there are a number that I think you're right, Tennille. We need to look at some quick wins, and be able to get the movement forward. I think people have been feeling like this is a heavy load and trudging along for years and years and years with no progress. And the Crisis Center has been doing tremendous work over the years, and again, feeling like this is really heavy lifting. So a couple of wins would be good. I think an easy win, in my view, and it touches upon a number of different issues, is to implement a strategic plan and to try to see if we can highlight, because that to me is, you get the ball rolling in communities. If you do, for an example, the intervention for men and boys, if you get that going and you look at, and you get that going, just for use for an example, 5 high schools, public high schools in the Bahamas, you already begin some discussion, some dialogue on this issue. To me, those are quick wins, easy wins for the government, but I don't know if they will see that as such. But in terms of thematically, which issues we should prioritize, I can't say. I would love to hear more and to speak more with NGOs who have actually been on the ground working on these issues, to be able to say what they think the priorities ought to be. For me, I think an easy step would be to implement a strategic plan. And in doing that, we actually implement also at the same time a lot of the recommendations coming out of these international agencies, and the low-hanging fruit from that strategic plan. Those are just the quick wins. There are a number of other recommendations that are intended to be more long-term and sort of progressively realized, but there are definitely those quick wins that we can see quite easily. But I'd love to hear from others if they know of, in their work in the communities, what would be sort of some quick wins or which are some of the low-hanging fruit that we can try to embrace. I keep thinking about this issue of access to services and the age of consent. I mean, to me, it doesn't make sense why we have different age of consent for boys and girls on certain issues. I mean, it's just, to me, it does not is not logical. I mean, why 16 for girls and 18 for boys? I mean, that's a quick fix. You know, and we have the number. I mean, yeah, I mean, you know, so those kinds of things, I would love to hear from others on that as well.
Well, I'll read aloud what our 6 demands are. So
Perfect.
the first is to update and implement the National Strategic Plan to end gender-based violence. The second is to fully comply with the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is known as CEDAW, and educate the public on the convention. The third is to fully comply with Belém do Pará and educate the public on that convention. The fourth is to criminalize marital rape by removing the words "who is not his spouse" from Article 3 of the Sexual Offences Act. The fifth is to record and publicly report on the gender-based killing of women and girls as femicide. And the sixth is to ratify the ILO's C-190 on eliminating violence and harassment in the world of work.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I think those are some very good ones.
Yeah, good stuff.
Very good ones. Yeah. Sorry, you wanted to say somebody else was speaking? You know, the last one you mentioned on harassment in the workplace, and as I mentioned when we did my first harassment campaign with the department, it was amazing how early harassment starts for girls. And I think it just, boys and girls are harassed, fine, I give you that. But girls are more so harassed at a very early age, as young as 7 and 8 years old. And so you can't say they're provocatively dressed. What are you wearing as a 7-year-old? A t-shirt and a little shorts and your flip-flops, or you're barefooted. I mean, that's how I was as a little girl at 7. And so, you know, riding your bike, climbing trees, doing things that 7-year-olds do. So what are you doing to, you know, encourage a man to harass you? Nothing. So we really need to think about that. I think in the world of work, it even intensifies. So what I want to say with that is, I think it's an excellent one to deal with it at work, but we also need to think about other entities or us. How can we address this issue at an earlier age? When I did it for the 11 and 12-year-olds in Grand Bahama, the Ministry of Education was saying to me, oh, you target the wrong group. You need to be 9, 10, 11 graders. Those are the ones that have this issue. But I think, and as I said to Bill, I didn't target them because we didn't have the money. But, you know, I think that the sooner we address this issue with children and they understand it and they know it and they kind of see what it is and have those kinds of conversations, I think the better. And it may even give them better protection when they get to be in grade 9, 10, and 11, where they're likely to face even more harassment. But the sooner those kids knew what we were talking about, they had questions. One kid was asking, you know, if I know of someone who's doing this and I kill him, would I go to jail? And so he's thinking in his little mind, he's 11, how he can respond. And, you know, another one was, if someone does this, will they be able to kill your mom, or will they be able to kill your sister? All these kinds of questions they're asking around that. So they're thinking, would they feel trapped? Because obviously the perpetrator is threatening them with these kinds of things, so they don't know what to do, and how to get help or where to get help. And it's a big question. How do you get that help, and where do you go, and how do we create safe spaces and trust in individuals, because it is about all of those things. And when you're 11, 12 years old, I think it must be horrendous to figure out who to talk to about it, because if you tell your mom, they may threaten to kill your mom, you know. And so it's quite interesting. In addition to the Ministry of Education person speaking to me on that, I would say that a couple of parents called to say that their children came home and was, you know, excitedly talking about it and saying what they learned and so forth. So the kids were very interested and they were listening. And I was happy that parents took the time to call, and they wrote, sent emails and so forth to the department saying, you know, thank you for sharing this, and this has been something I've been trying to discuss with them, and I don't really know how to do it. And so we had some sessions with social services on how to really engage on these issues. But my point was really that harassment is as early as 7 and 8 years old, all the way up to the workplace. And it's something that we need to be thinking about in a real way in this country. Yeah, unfortunately.
Definitely. So tomorrow is International Human Rights Day. Can you tell us a little bit about how you've celebrated this day in the past, and maybe what you would like everyone to walk away with from this session on, I don't know, 5 words to think of when you hear the words human rights?
You know, for me, I've always been away for human rights. I've not really celebrated, well, not always, I guess. Yeah, I guess for the last 20 something years, I've been away for Human Rights Day. And so I've celebrated it in the context of the UN. So we've really been around the theme for the day. And it's really, we have lots of activities, and it's, again, you know, these sort of, I call them events and ceremonial activities. They bring up a lot of wonderful ideas, and people do stuff globally around it, but then it fizzles out and nobody wants to hear about human rights again. And so, and I have to say that, you know, it's a big thing in some countries, but not so big in others, right? And so we have to figure out where we are as a country. I think it should be bigger in the Bahamas. It is. There's no reason why it shouldn't be. And I venture to say, and I could, you know, correct me, please, this is just an opinion here, that it has a lot to do with the fact that there is a perception that human rights are foreign and they're not Bahamian, or they're not consistent with our culture and so forth and so on, which is very, very untrue. And, you know, so I often think of my grandmother, who was such a human rights advocate for the poor. She was off of Hay Street, and she worked all of her life at Purity Bakery, and she was able to negotiate with the owners of Purity Bakery back in the day to keep the what they would call stale bread and all that stuff, and to be able, instead of throwing it away, but to keep it. And so she was walking through Grantstown like the Pied Piper, and all sorts of people in this community. I remember Arlington Butler, before he passed, mentioned to me, oh, your grandmother used to be waiting outside to get bread from her. So, I mean, she walked through that community feeding people. Yeah, and recognizing that children are hungry and saying to them, go to school, and when you come back, come by the bakery, you're going to get a cookie, you're going to get, you know, something, you know, encouraging them to stay in school. Thinking about her, who took her 2 daughters, she has 2 girls, no boys, and she wanted them to go to school. After a certain point, you couldn't go to school. My mom is 88 and her sister is 90. And they couldn't go to school after a certain age back then, and only the private schools, the Catholic schools. So she went to the priest and said, I want my daughters to go to school here. And they said, well, you can't, because they're Catholic. And she said, well, you know, they can become Catholic. I want them to get education. I want them to be educated. I mean, that's not an ideal story necessarily, but it's a story to show that people were pushing for rights in different ways back then. Women were pushing for the right to vote. People were pushing on land rights issues and so forth, to ensure that so there are many different, to say that human rights has nothing to do with us. Okay, we may not call them rights, but they are rights. And it's about how we actually break them down. And the words that I would use are the words that I talked about earlier. And I talk about rights. I want us to understand that human rights is a part of who we are. as a people, and it ought to be intertwined with how we develop as a people. Human rights are about how we respect, tolerate, engage, include, and promote the rights for everyone in the country. That's what it is for me. It's really around those issues of respect and inclusion and tolerance and non-discrimination and participation and equality, and not cherry picking this particular right or this particular group. You can get it if you're this, but you can't, your children can't go to school, preschool or kindergarten if they happen to be of Haitian descent, or whatever it is. So you can't, you're afraid to go and get the vaccine because you don't want to be deported, or you're afraid to go get health care because of whatever reason, right? So we have to bring human rights into the question as we deal with all these issues of development. And there's no aspect of development that does not include rights. None. And I challenge you to come up with one because it affects everything that we do and where we live and the things that happen to us as a country. So COVID, as we know, came up with, we saw so many violations of human rights and in the COVID, and it became real, even more real. The inequalities in society, more real. The discrimination and the violence, more real. The situation of mental health as a right, more real. The situation of communicable diseases, access to water, everything, job insecurity, everything is just can come into play. We talk a lot about climate, and it's about the rights, and the impact of, an example, natural disasters on violence against women. So just to say that human rights are all inclusive, we should not be cherry picking rights. We ought to think about all human rights, all civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights for all human beings in this country. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah.
Sorry.
We'll certainly keep these things in mind. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Global 16 Days campaign ends tomorrow, but we are taking everything that we've learned into next year, and we'll be thinking about 365 days of activism. So
awesome.
Very helpful. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Gaynell.
My pleasure. I hope it was helpful to everyone, and I enjoyed the opportunity to discuss with you.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining us. Please stay tuned to our social media channels, Equality242 on Instagram, Equality242 on Twitter, and Facebook.com/Equality242. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.